Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I have risen from the grave once again, this time to talk more about dialogue, but first I have a rather pathetic writing update to get out of the way. So currently the project total is sitting at 110,150 words, which means that I haven't really written that much since I last made a video almost a month ago, a little over a month ago. I don't know, time is a weird soup. Part of that is that I actually didn't do any writing from April 29th to May 11th, and even this past week I haven't really been doing too much. The big thing is that I've just hit something of a slump lately because between work, powerlifting, and busy weekends, all coupled with the usual self-doubt that comes when you get in deep into a story in the middle, I've just been kind of down on my writing, down on life in general, and just kind of needed a break. And so to preserve my sanity, I decided it was fine to just pause for a few weeks and do other things, just take some time to relax. And usually what I do when I am on a break from writing, I try to engage with some media that is new to me, whether that's a video game, a movie, a TV show, a book, whatever. Coincidentally, a game called Clair Obscur Expedition 33 came out really recently, and I have spent a lot of time playing that lately, and by golly, I am having a blast. I'm planning to talk more about the state of the book itself and the project in the next video, which I hope will be next week, but let's be real, I'm not promising consistency at this point. But I will also definitely be talking about Clair Obscur at some point in the future because it's just absolutely perfect, absolute cinema, and everybody should play it. So 2 months ago, I made a video as a broad overview of dialogue and why it's important. While a given scene doesn't need to include dialogue, and in fact, a whole story can be told without dialogue, you'll find that most stories across all mediums end up having some measure of dialogue between characters. Today, I want to actually drill down into dialogue construction and give some actual concrete examples of weak dialogue versus stronger dialogue. I say stronger in this case because I spent like half an hour putting these examples together, so the good examples are not amazing, they're just hopefully better than the bad examples. I've created two different scenarios with a quick back and forth between two characters to demonstrate the differences between weak and stronger dialogue. With that, then there are two versions of each scene, and though they're pretty short overall, I think you'll see the difference in the quality pretty easily. Now, of course, in a book, dialogue quality is determined by more than just the words the characters are speaking, since you'll generally weave in one or more of action, mannerisms, dialogue tags, internal monologues, and so on. For the sake of brevity, I've made these pretty short overall, and I whittled the examples down to have as little non-dialogue, non-speaking parts as possible. So without further ado, let's get into this. All right, so scenario number one is Dave and Brian in the workplace with a topic about upcoming layoffs being presented. So let's start with the bad version. Brian was in the break room when Dave entered. "Hey Dave," Brian said. "How are you feeling about the upcoming layoffs?" "Hi Brian," Dave said. "The layoffs are making me really nervous. I sure hope I don't lose my job." "I actually hate working here, so I wouldn't be too upset," Brian laughed. Dave did not laugh. "That may be true, but I am passionate about having money to afford my house and eat food." "Oh well," Brian shrugged. "It is out of our control." And now here's the better version. Brian leaned against the break room counter, mindlessly scrolling on his phone while the microwave hummed. He glanced up as Dave walked through the open door. "Hey Dave," Brian said. How are you feeling about that email?" Dave grimaced and stalked to the coffee maker. "I'm nervous as hell about losing my job," he replied. "Why are they laying people off when we just posted record profits last quarter?" "Beats me," Brian said. "But hey, if someone has to go, I'll volunteer. I hate it here." He forced out a laugh. "I'm glad you think it's funny," Dave said. "I'm going to lose my house if I end up out of work for too long." "Right," Brian muttered, shrugging. "Well, it's out of our control either way." All right, so looking back at both of these examples, you'll see in the bad version that I'm pretty light on details, obviously. It's mostly dialogue and dialogue tags. It's a little repetitious in Brian said, Dave said, but at the same time, kind of in the modern construction of stories, a lot of people say said is blind, whereas the reader is not really going to notice said as a dialogue tag compared to a lot of other dialogue tags. Things that are kind of safe dialogue tag wise are said, asked, replied. Those are pretty basic and they don't draw too much attention. Now, personally, I think it's totally fine to be a little bit more expressive with dialogue tags if it fits the scene. And so having somebody say, shouted, yelled, exclaimed, all of those are fine. It just kind of depends on how you want the character to present what they're saying. But anyway, in this bad version, it's pretty light on detail, obviously, of like what's going on. I led with one sentence. Brian was in the break room when Dave entered. This assumes that you have some general knowledge of what a corporate American break room looks like, and obviously I fleshed that out a tiny bit more in the better example. But Dave enters ostensibly to talk to Brian. We don't really know in this scene because it's lacking the detail. The big thing is that the dialogue is pretty stilted. Obviously I have a greeting, and then Brian said, and then a statement, well, a question. Then I have, again, a greeting, Dave said, and then statement. And that's kind of repetitious. It's not too bad when it's honestly just two sentences back to back. But if you have a longer section of dialogue, you want to be really careful about how similar they sound and how similarly they are constructed, because when you get too repetitious, the reader will start to get bored. Now, something else I want to draw attention to is I intentionally misused dialogue tags in this bad example, because I have Brian laughed after a comma and a quotation mark. This is actually something that I see a lot of people get wrong kind of when they're inexperienced as writers, but even not inexperienced. I've seen it from experienced writers. So whenever you have a dialogue sentence that ends with a comma and you have the dialogue tag after that, the dialogue tag needs to be an actual speaking verb and not an action verb. Now, Brian laughed actually kind of toes a fine line between those two, because you can speak with a laugh. And so that's honestly not too bad. But if you want to draw better distinction for that, you would want to say, Brian said laughing or something along those lines. Now, the egregious example is the Brian shrugged in the last sentence there, because shrug is purely a physical action. You can't shrug a word out of your mouth. So in this case, it shouldn't be Brian shrugged. That's why I fixed it to Brian muttered, shrugging in the second example. The other problem here in the bad version is the characters obviously are just plainly speaking with no real sense of being an actual person. They're just delivering information. So it's expository dialogue that doesn't actually give you any feeling of how the characters actually are. They're just stating exactly what's on their mind with no real mannerisms or emotions or anything built into it. So it reads as pretty boring. And while I do think it's funny, the last sentence with Dave about being passionate about having money to afford his house and eat food, that's actually what I say too when I'm talking about work. But most people don't say that, and that's really obviously me, the author, putting a statement that I make into the character's mouth rather than the character driving the way that the character speaks. Now, in the better version, obviously I lead with a little bit better intro into where we are. Again, this kind of assumes you know what a break room in corporate America looks like, but also it includes that we are in contemporary modern Earth, that Brian is mindlessly scrolling on his phone while the microwave is going on, and then he glances up as Dave walks through the open door. In this one, obviously I have the characters speak with a little bit more emphasis on contractions first and foremost, because most of us, when we speak English in the modern era, we use contractions a lot. I have Brian trying to approach this topic with a little bit more tact, hence the how are you feeling? And then I have Dave actually have some action. Dave grimaced and stalked the coffee maker. And then, he says that he's nervous. And this is where I use he replied instead of just he said again, because then I go back to Brian said in the next one. Obviously, these sentences I think read a little bit better because they are more varied in the length of the sentences and also just different punctuation marks. And then I end that paragraph with he forced out a laugh. So in this case, it's not just Brian laughing as dialogue. In this case, now you see that he's forcing out a laugh, as in that he doesn't actually find this funny, but it's a character who obviously copes with humor. And this is kind of the subtext aspect of writing in general, where if you have a character who forces out a laugh, you know that they're not really genuine with their laughter, but they're trying to be positive maybe, or kind of quell a hard situation. There are a lot of different ways you can take it. That's kind of the beauty of subtext. And then obviously Dave as a character here does not find this funny and doesn't appreciate the forced laughter and states why he's worried about losing work. But obviously this is a much more realistic way of stating it, and also a much more relevant concern that modern people can actually, jive with. And then in that last part, I put Brian muttered, shrugging. So this way Brian has a different dialogue tag, and muttered I think is a much more specific way of saying that, somebody said something under their breath or spoke softly. I'm not opposed to adverbs, frankly, and I think speaking quietly is different than muttering or whispering, but that's also up to the individual writer and how your beta reader feedback goes. So that's kind of just something to keep in mind. But anyway, so I put Brian muttered shrugging to this way show that he has the specific type of dialogue that he's speaking, and then also the action of shrugging. And then we kind of see him go again with the same text of, well, it's out of our control either way. So I think the second version is better. I don't think that this is like amazing. Like I said, these are pretty quick examples, but I think that you can see what's different between the two and why the second one works better than the first. All right, so now we have scenario 2, which is Sarah and Gale at school, and this is about studying for a test. Let's start with the bad version. Why are you studying for the test? Sarah asked. I am really nervous about failing, Gale said. You have never failed a test, Sarah said. Why is this one different? My class grade is at a 93%, so if I get an A- on the test, I'm going to have an A- on my report card, Gale said. My parents said they will buy me a car if I have straight A's. Normal people wish they had your problems, Sarah said. You'll be fine. Now let's take a look at the better version. Sarah found Gale in the lunchroom, poring over their math textbook instead of eating. What are you doing? Sarah asked. Studying, Gale said without looking up. What does it look like? Sarah's brow rose. Studying? You? You've never failed a test in your life. You've never even gotten a B. Gale huffed. This test could take me from an A to an A-, and if I don't have straight A's, my parents won't buy me a car like they said. You know, Sarah said, sitting across from her friend, normal people would love to have your problems. You're going to be fine. So in the bad version, starting off at a glance, I would say a big problem is that all 5 of the lines here all begin with quote marks. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it does get repetitious once again. I don't know why, but I personally try to limit to having 3 paragraphs in a row start with quote marks. And if they're longer sections of a character speaking, it's a little better and you can get away with it more. But if it's like 3 quick sentences, having those quote marks all in a row becomes very evident. And so by the time I get to the 4th paragraph, I try to start with action instead of dialogue. In this case, I had the first character, Sarah, just go ahead and start asking a question. So I don't establish at all where we are, what's going on, who's talking, other than I say Sarah, but we don't have any sense of what's going on and where we are. This is what they call white room syndrome in writing, where if you have characters just engaging in dialogue with no actual setting built around them, and not that the setting has to be like a hard thing. You don't have to describe for paragraphs and paragraphs where somebody is, but establishing at least that we are in some kind of room or outside or somewhere is very helpful for rooting a reader in a scene. Now, once again, in this one, I had the characters again speaking just very plainly, not a lot of contractions in their dialogue, and they're all just kind of saying what's on their mind. Once again, in 4 of the 5 paragraphs here, I use the word said as the dialogue tag, and then also it's a little repetitious even more because I have Gale said, my parents said in that 4th paragraph. And that's another tricky thing too, because you don't necessarily want to have said as a dialogue tag followed by a character saying the word said, because then it becomes very repetitious, even more so than having said as your dialogue tag over and over. Now in the better version, I have Sarah finding Gale in the lunchroom to at least once again establish a little bit of scene of what's going on. Again, this kind of assumes that you have a sense of what a contemporary, probably American school looks like, and that we have lunchrooms and that people might be doing homework during lunch if they're using their time wisely, or if they have work that they need to crunch for, like studying for a test. And so in this case, I have different dialogue tags. Obviously, I have asked and said, and sometimes I don't even include them. So you'll see in paragraphs 1 and 2, I included dialogue tags. I gave Gale a little bit more action. Gale said without looking up, describes that she's still looking at the book. She's not bothering to acknowledge her friend. Then Sarah's brow rose, and then we go into the dialogue. So this way we have a physical expression versus relying on a dialogue tag to express, what's going on with her. And then same thing in the 4th paragraph, start off with Gale huffed and then dialogue. Now this part in the 4th paragraph does help because it eliminates said as a dialogue tag and keeps said as a word in the dialogue. The one caveat here is that I then in the 5th paragraph have Sarah said as a dialogue tag. So even then, if I were doing a little bit longer revision, I would probably try to find something different. maybe Sarah stated, or just like her parents claimed they would, something to just keep those saids not so close together. And then also paragraph 3 and 4, while they do both start with action, they both start with a character's name. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes you're gonna have a short, like, Sarah's brow rose, Gale huffed, etc., etc. And that's okay. It also depends on the genre you're writing in, depends on the grade level you're writing for, depends on the whether it's adult, YA, etc., etc. Anyway, I think this one flows better because I have the characters once again doing a little bit more with action and not just the words that they're speaking. And then I also put in a little bit more emphasis with the italics. I have an exclamation mark in here. And I think those things help. Definitely be sparing with exclamation marks, definitely in your actual writing sections. Dialogue is a little bit different because dialogue is stylized to a specific character. So you can use a little bit more exclamation marks in the dialogue, but even then I try to be pretty sparing, which is why I only have one here on this page, even though Gale is obviously pretty flustered and upset about this potential test that she might fail, which she probably won't because she's obviously a straight A student. But this was a very real concern I had when I was in school, and that even getting an A- was bad and I had to have straight A's or else doom and gloom awaited me at home. The other piece I wanted to draw attention to is the 5th paragraph. I have it saying, Sarah said, sitting across from her friend, normal people, blah, blah, blah. You'll notice there that I have a comma after the first section of dialogue, followed by the subject, the dialogue tag, the action that she's doing, followed by a comma, and then the quote mark, and then we resume the dialogue. When you have that kind of dialogue tag splitting dialogue, you want to make sure that you have a lowercase letter starting the second part of the dialogue. You don't recapitalize it. If I had wanted to put a period at the end of friend, then I would capitalize normal. In this case, this is, again, kind of an arbitrary decision for the writer to make. I wanted this to have a little bit of a flow. And so I view it when you have the 2 commas situation like this, is that the character is speaking while they're doing the action, versus if I put a period after friend, I would have it, in my mind at least, I would think about it as the character saying the first part, then doing the action, then continuing to speak. So again, it just depends on how you want the scene to flow and what kind of impression you want to give the reader. You may have noticed in both these scenarios, I have the characters speaking in a pretty much modern American way. I want to note that while being aware of how real people speak is helpful, you also need to balance that against the setting and the culture in which your story takes place. Characters in your fictional world are in fact allowed to speak differently from modern Westerners. So just because these examples involve contemporary American settings and speech, you don't have to abide by our ordinary modern day styles of speaking when you're creating a story. People all have different cadences in their speech, different ways of pausing or emphasizing words, and so on. And keeping the construction of those mannerisms in mind and having them be consistent from book to book is more important than trying to have your characters set in a quasi-medieval secondary world sound like modern Americans, dealing with modern American problems, looking at you, Brandon Sanderson. Similarly, feel free to break our modern speaking conventions when you're constructing your own societies and worlds. For example, you could have a culture where contractions don't exist in the language, or where people always refer to themselves in the third person and the word I doesn't exist. The options are endless. Of course, none of this is to say that you can't also abide by ordinary speaking conventions as well. It's all about what fits best for your characters and your story. Anyway, that's about it for today. I just wanted to throw together something quickly to better illustrate strategies for making little tweaks to improve dialogue. I by no means hold myself up as an expert dialogue writer, but I do keep these concepts in mind when I'm trying to write or revise dialogue. As always, thanks for stopping by the channel. I hope you've found this video helpful and insightful and maybe a little titillating. Leave a comment below if you have any thoughts on dialogue construction. Do you find these tips helpful? Do you have other tips to share? If you liked the video, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. As always, I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you here in the next video.